Sam Giancana. On the night of June 19, 1975, a man stood at the stove in the basement kitchen of a quiet home in Oak Park, Illinois, frying sausage and peppers for a late dinner. He was days away from being flown to Washington to testify before a Senate committee about secret work the mob had once done for the Central Intelligence Agency. He never made the trip. Someone who knew him well enough to be let downstairs walked up behind him, put a single bullet in the back of his head, then fired 6 more into his face and throat, and slipped back out into the night. The man was Salvatore Giancana, born Guillermo Giancana in Chicago's Little Italy in May of 1908, the son of Sicilian immigrants. As a teenager, he ran with the 42 Gang, a vicious juvenile crew that fed talent up into the larger organization, and he earned his early reputation behind the wheel as a getaway driver and a killer. By the mid-1960s, he had been arrested somewhere around 70 times. He served 5 years for burglary and another 4 for running an illegal still, and after that second stretch, he engineered the violent takeover of the black-run gambling rackets on the South Side, a numbers operation that moved enormous amounts of cash. The campaign included the 1952 murder of a rival boss named Theodore Rowe, a man who had refused to hand over his territory. That single act of muscle absorbed a fortune into the outfit and proved Giancana could deliver. That was the job that made him. In 1957, Giancana became the public boss of the Chicago outfit. But everyone inside the organization understood that real power still sat with 2 older men, Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, and that Giancana had to clear his biggest decisions, including murders, with them. That same year, he attended the infamous National Mob Summit at Appalachian, New York. And where Accardo and Ricca made an art of being invisible, Giancana wanted the lights. He golfed and caroused with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. He dated the singer Phyllis McGuire. And he was linked to a woman named Judith Campbell Exner, who later claimed she carried sealed envelopes back and forth between Giancana and President John Kennedy. Then there was Cuba. Declassified agency files confirmed that in September of 1960, the spy agency reached out through a former federal agent and a mobster named Johnny Roselli and pulled Giancana into a plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. Giancana's contribution to the planning was characteristically practical. Forget the gangland shooting, he suggested. Use poison pills. That kind of profile came with a price. The federal surveillance on him grew so tight, it became known as lockstep. Agents standing a few feet away from him on the golf course, ruining his every move. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department made him a personal target. In 1965, he was offered immunity, refused to talk to a grand jury anyway, and was jailed for contempt. When he got out the following year, he fled to Mexico, where he ran casinos and kept the profits for himself. Refusing to share with Chicago was a fatal breach of the rules, and Accardo forced him out of power. When Mexico finally extradited him back to the United States in 1974, Giancana was a man with no protection left and a date on the calendar to go tell his secrets to the United States government. The killing that followed had a grammar to it. The cluster of wounds around his mouth was read by investigators as a message about what happens to men who talk. No one was ever charged. The theories have run from an outfit hit sanctioned at the very top to the very intelligence agency he had once worked for. In recent years, one Chicago investigative reporter went further still, alleging that Accardo personally carried out the killing. And no, that part is not me reaching. The Senate committee that wanted Giancana's testimony was investigating exactly those plots against Castro when he died. Suspicion settled hardest on the one man Giancana had answered to for nearly 20 years. He was older, quieter, and very nearly impossible to convict. Tony Accardo. Here is a record almost no figure in American organized crime can match. The man who ran the Chicago outfit, on and off, for roughly 3 decades, reputedly spent a single night of his life in jail and was never once convicted of a felony that stuck. So how does someone govern the largest crime syndicate in the Midwest from the 1940s into the 1980s and still walk away clean? The answer was discipline, patience, and a near-religious commitment to staying out of the photograph. Antonino Accardo was born in Chicago in April of 1906 and left school at 14. He joined a street crew called the Circus Cafe Gang and was recruited into the Capone organization by one of its deadliest gunmen, Jack McGurn. He picked up 2 nicknames that followed him for the rest of his life. The first was Joe Batters, earned, the story goes, for beating men to death with a baseball bat. Capone himself reportedly looked him over and said the kid was a real Joe Batters. The second came in 1939, after a fishing trip to Nova Scotia where Accardo landed a tuna that weighed 400 pounds. The Chicago papers christened him the Big Tuna, and that one stuck too. He may have been one of the gunmen in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, and he ranked 7th on Chicago's very first public enemy list in 1931. He rose to captain, then to underboss when Paul Ricca took the top job after Frank Nitty's suicide in 1943, and he ran the day-to-day while Ricca was locked up. Ricca's verdict on him became legend inside the outfit. He used to say that Accardo had more brains for breakfast than Capone had in his whole lifetime. What Accardo built was a machine. He controlled the racing wire that bookmakers depended on, ran slot and vending operations, pushed outfit money into Las Vegas and Havana casinos, and extended the organization's reach into Milwaukee, Iowa, and beyond. And he made one rule that historians credit for the outfit's long survival: stay out of heavy narcotics. The federal attention it brought simply was not worth the money. Above all, he governed from behind a series of public bosses, installing a front man when the heat was low and removing him the moment prosecutors closed in. Giancana, Battaglia, Aldericio, Ayupa, every one of them held the title at Accardo's pleasure, and every one of them paid the price he avoided. He let other men wear the crown so that he could keep his hands clean. His reputation for cold patience was not a myth. In 1978, while he was vacationing in California, burglars broke into his home in River Forest. Over the following weeks, several men suspected of the break-in turned up dead, their throats cut. Years later, a cooperating outfit member named Nicholas Calabresi confirmed those killings under oath in open court. Nobody robbed Tony Accardo and lived to brag about it. Through all of it, prosecutors could not make anything hold. A tax conviction in 1960 was overturned on appeal. One national magazine simply described him as the reputed boss who denied the job and eluded every prosecutor who came for him. Asked directly whether he ran the mob, Accardo would shrug and say he had no control over anybody, that he had never been a boss in his life. He lived quietly with his wife Clarice, whom he married in 1934, preferred a night at home to a night on the town, and in old age walked with a cane carved in the shape of a fish. He died of heart and respiratory failure in May of 1992, at the age of 86. When the news broke, the Chicago Crime Commission called it the end of the Capone era. He had outlasted nearly everyone, and he had done it by making sure the men who took the public title also took the public fall. One of the earliest of those front men was a former teenage stick-up artist with a temper as large as his ambition, Sam Battaglia. Picture the sheer nerve of this. In 1930, a 22-year-old street tough robbed the wife of the mayor of Chicago of around $15,500 in jewelry. And then, almost for sport, took the gun and the badge off the police officer who was escorting her. That young man was Salvatore Battaglia, and that brazen, almost theatrical confidence is exactly what carried him to the doorstep of the most feared criminal organization in the city. Battaglia came up out of the same 42 gang that produced Giancana, and he was born in Chicago in November of 1908. His nickname, Teats, has a couple of competing origin stories. One version says he simply lost his front teeth. The more colorful one has him snarling at another mobster to shut up before he busted him in the teeth, and the slurred pronunciation stuck to him for life. He ran his loan sharking operation out of the back room of a restaurant called the Casa Madrid in Melrose Park, where men who could not make their payments were beaten, and sometimes worse. Over the years, investigators suspected him in roughly 7 murders, and not one of them was ever pinned to him in a courtroom. What separated Battaglia from the average enforcer was that he turned violence into a genuine business. He grew rich off the juice loans, the gambling, and the muscle, and he ran much of it from a farm out west of the city, a long way from the back room where the beatings happened. By the time the older generation started looking for a successor, Battaglia was no longer just a strong arm. He was a wealthy crew chief with his own territory and his own reputation. By the mid-1960s, he was widely seen as Giancana's heir apparent, the natural choice to step up when the boss went down. So when Giancana was jailed and then fled to Mexico, Battaglia took over as acting boss in 1965. By most accounts, he accepted the role reluctantly, and for good reason. Accardo was still the true authority behind the curtain, which meant the front boss was the man who would absorb the federal heat. That heat arrived in the form of an Internal Revenue Service special agent named Jack Walsh, who patiently built the case that brought him down. Walsh did not soften his description of his target. He called Battaglia the Don of the Chicago Mafia, a man whose street name was Teats and who ran the entire outfit out of a farm west of the city. In the spring of 1967, Battaglia was convicted of extorting a construction company through threats and intimidation, and a judge handed him 15 years. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he had been framed, that the government had manufactured a case against him because of who he was rather than what he had done. The jury did not agree. Whatever the truth of that claim, the sentence quietly became a death sentence. Behind bars, Battaglia was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and as it spread, there was nothing the prison doctors could do for him. In late August of 1973, the federal system paroled him from the medical center at Springfield, Missouri, and sent him home to die. He lasted 11 days, passing away on September 7, 1973. There is one strange, almost tender footnote to all of it. Decades later, a grandson named Bates Battaglia would grow up to play professional hockey in the National Hockey League, carrying the family name to a kind of clean, public fame the old man never could have imagined from the back room of that Melrose Park restaurant. You would think a name like that would stay buried with the man who built it. It did the opposite. Battaglia's downfall opened another vacancy near the top of the organization, and the man who had served as one of its most feared killers, often working at Battaglia's side, was next in line for a turn in the spotlight. He was also, by every account, one of the most dangerous men the outfit ever put on a payroll. Felix Aldericio. In May of 1962, Chicago police pulled over a car and found something that read like a prop from a crime film. The vehicle had been customized with switches that let the driver kill the headlights and the taillights independently, perfect for vanishing on a dark road. Hidden inside was a compartment fitted with clamps built to hold shotguns and rifles. This was not really a car at all. It was a purpose-built murder machine, and the man who owned it was Felix Alderete. Alderete was born in Yonkers, New York, in April of 1912. His family later moved to Milwaukee, where he reportedly boxed under the name Milwaukee Phil. Brought into the outfit in the early 1930s by a cousin, he rose to become one of its most feared enforcers, a man suspected in 13 or 14 contract killings. When he was not killing people, he worked as a bagman, carrying envelopes of cash to the judges and police officers who kept the machine running. Few men in Chicago inspired more fear, and fewer still survived long enough to talk about why. He partnered most closely with another notorious gunman named Charles Nicoletti, and that very same month, the police found his customized hit car. The two of them took part in the torture killing of 2 associates. They did the job alongside a brutal young up-and-comer named Tony Spilotro, a name that would haunt the outfit for another 20 years. The savagery of that double murder was so extreme that it was still being whispered about in mob circles decades later, a benchmark for how far these men were willing to go. Away from the killing, Alderete ran rackets across Milwaukee, partnered with that city's crime boss, and headed a jewel burglary ring that worked Chicago's wealthy Gold Coast, robbing the homes and hotel rooms of the rich. He even traveled overseas to help arrange the smuggling of heroin back into the United States. But the detail that humanizes him, in the strangest possible way, is his obsession with photographing ancient ruins. He would return from his trips with stacks of photographs of crumbling Roman stonework. There is a famous wiretap recording of Giancana exploding at him over the hobby, snapping that he had police agents coming out of his eyeballs while Alderete sat there talking to him about ruins. It is a small, almost comic glimpse of the man behind the body count. In 1965, his reputation finally caught up with him in a Denver courtroom. He and 2 associates were convicted in a case built on a threat made against a local attorney named Robert Sunshine. Alderete had reportedly walked straight up to the man and told him flatly that someone named Ruby had sent them and that they had come there to kill him. It was the kind of sentence that leaves absolutely no room for misunderstanding, and a jury heard it that way too. He served a stretch as underboss to Giancana, then took his own turn as front boss from roughly 1967 to 1969. The trouble was, he was never popular with the rank and file. Where Accardo commanded respect and Giancana at least had charisma, Alderete inspired mostly fear and resentment, and a boss who is only feared by his own men is a boss with a short shelf life. His time at the top proved exactly that. Convicted again, this time on extortion and fraud charges, he was sent to the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, in 1969. You would expect a man like that to die violently, the way so many around him had. Instead, he died of natural causes inside that prison in September of 1971, and Tony Accardo, the man who had quietly outranked them all, came to the funeral. By the early 1970s, the outfit needed yet another front man, and it turned to a former prizefighter who controlled one of the most lucrative towns in the region. He would also earn the single most absurd nickname in Chicago mob history, and he would earn it not through murder or extortion, but through a roadside encounter in a Kansas field. Joey Aiuppa. In 1962, at the very height of Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime, federal agents stopped and searched a car in rural Kansas. What they found inside had nothing to do with gambling, loan sharking, or murder. It was 563 frozen doves, hundreds of birds over the legal hunting limit. The man behind the wheel happened to be one of the highest-ranking figures in the entire Chicago outfit. And from that day forward, the most feared boss in the town of Cicero would be known, with no small amount of mockery, as Joey Doves. Joseph Aiuppa was born in Melrose Park, Illinois, in December of 1907, the son of Sicilian immigrants. He had been a boxer in his youth, fighting under an Irish ring name to draw bigger purses, and he came up as a driver for Tony Accardo. The territory he eventually controlled was Cicero, the suburb that ran on bookmaking, slot machines, underground casinos, and a strip of clubs and hotels built on vice. Early in his career, he even operated a furniture company that was, in reality, a front for manufacturing illegal slot machines. The Dove arrest turned into a minor federal conviction, a 3-month sentence, and a $1,000 fine for violating a bird protection law. He came out of it with a nickname that would dog him for the rest of his life, and a position inside the organization that only kept rising. In 1971, Ayupa became the outfit's front boss, taking quiet counsel from the aging Accardo, and he steered the organization through its most profitable years. Under his command, the mob tapped a Teamsters Union pension fund to finance Las Vegas casinos, then skimmed the gambling profits off the top before the money was ever officially counted. He was also widely tied to the June 1986 murders of the Spilatro brothers, 2 bodies later dug out of an Indiana cornfield. That same Las Vegas skimming scheme is what finally broke him. The case was tried in Kansas City before a federal judge named Joseph Stevens, and it became known as the Strawman prosecution, built on hidden recordings and the cooperation of a Las Vegas insider who turned witness against the men he had once worked for. In January of 1986, Ayupa was convicted alongside a whole row of senior outfit and allied figures, including John Cerrone, Angelo LaPietra, and Joseph Lombardo. Prosecutors proved the group had used its grip on union officials to skim around $2 million from casinos, including the Stardust and the Fremont. And somehow, it gets worse for them, because the lead prosecutor framed the entire trial as a test of whether men who insulate themselves with countless millions and never flinch at using deadly force could ever be held to account. There is one detail worth flagging plainly here, because the record itself disagrees with the headlines. Most press accounts say Ayupa received 28 years. The federal appeals court record puts the figure closer to 20 and a half. Either way, for a man already in his late 70s, it amounted to the rest of his life. He was fined $80,000 and shipped off to the penitentiary at Marion. Ayupa served his time, was released in January of 1996, and died the following year, in February of 1997, at the age of 89. He was buried in a Catholic cemetery just outside Chicago. His conviction had finally swept the entire old guard off the board. But the outfit did not collapse with him. Someone was already stepping quietly into the vacuum he left behind. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Joseph Ferriola. He may be the only Chicago mob boss in history to die on an operating table, mid-surgery, in the middle of receiving his second heart transplant. And the man whose worn-out heart finally gave out was the same man federal agents had spent years describing, without a trace of exaggeration, as a cold-blooded terrorist. While he lay dying in a Houston hospital, prosecutors back in Chicago were still quietly typing up the racketeering indictment they had been building against him for years. Joseph Ferriola was born on the near west side of Chicago in March of 1927. He came up under a veteran gangster named Leonard Caifano and learned the trade from the inside, the gambling, the extortion, and the kind of violence that made the first two possible. In 1970, he was convicted in an interstate gambling conspiracy and drew a 5-year sentence, serving roughly 3 of those years. By the time he came home, he had a reputation as one of the most effective and frightening enforcers the outfit had. The man you sent when a message absolutely had to be delivered. He built his power base in Cicero, running the gambling rackets across a wide stretch of counties north and west of the city, with a trusted underboss named Ernest Infelice at his side. He controlled bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion, and he ran all of it with a discipline that set him apart. Where men like Giancana craved attention, Ferriola wanted none of it. His moment came at the end of 1985. The straw man prosecution in Kansas City had just gutted the top of the organization, sending Joey Aiuppa and John Cerrone to prison and leaving the outfit leaderless at the worst possible time. With the old guard gone and Accardo aging and ill, the organization needed someone who could hold it together without tearing it apart from the inside. Ferriola was that man. With Accardo's quiet blessing, he took control and did something that, in mob terms, almost never happens cleanly. He stabilized a sinking ship. His leadership style was built around a single obsession, and that obsession was insulation. He had watched federal informants and hidden microphones destroy boss after boss, and he was determined not to be next. So he layered the organization with non-member buffers, men who could take an order and pass it down without ever being able to testify to a face-to-face conversation with the boss. He pulled the outfit back from the flashy, high-visibility ventures that drew federal cameras. Under Ferriola, the mob got quieter, harder to surveil, and far harder to prosecute. He was not entirely invisible, though. He drew attention when he built a sprawling 14-room home worth $500,000 in Oak Brook, not far from where Aiuppa had lived. For a man whose entire philosophy was about staying out of sight, the mansion was a strange and very public indulgence. But there was one enemy that all of Ferriola's insulation could do nothing about, and that was his own failing body. He suffered from chronic, severe heart disease, and on top of it, cancer. By late 1988, his health had collapsed to the point where he could no longer run the day-to-day operations, and he was forced into a kind of semi-retirement. He handed control to a longtime associate, a driver-turned-crew chief named Sam Carlisi. In March of 1989, in a hospital in Houston, Texas, Ferriola underwent a second heart transplant, believed to be the first time a reputed mob boss had ever attempted such a thing. He did not survive it. He died on March 11, 1989, just days short of his 62nd birthday. At the moment of his death, federal prosecutors were still assembling the racketeering case they had hoped would finally put him away. The indictment was never filed. The disease beat them to him. His bloodline ran deep into the outfit's history. His nephew was a feared hitman named Harry Alleman, and years later, his own son would draw a prison sentence in the sprawling federal case that eventually unraveled much of what these men had built, ordered to forfeit more than $9 million. Ferriola had pulled off the near impossible. He had taken command of an organization that should have splintered and held it together for 4 short years. But the man he handed it to was, by nearly every account, nowhere close to his equal, and the cracks would begin to show almost immediately. Sam Carlisi. He earned his nickname because he could lose a police tail in a moving car, slipping into traffic and vanishing every time they thought they finally had him. He rose all the way to the very top of the Chicago outfit. So why did the people who studied organized crime for a living end up calling him one of the weakest bosses the organization ever produced? Samuel Carlisi was born in Buffalo, New York, in December of 1921, though some records place the year a little earlier. He had organized crime in his blood. His brother Rosario was a high-ranking member of the Buffalo crime family, close to its longtime boss, which gave Sam a set of East Coast connections that most Chicago men never had. But it was in Chicago that he made his name, and he made it behind the wheel. He started out as a driver for Joey Aiuppa in Cicero, and that is where the nickname Wings came from. He had a gift for eluding the police, for melting into traffic with a carload of mobsters while the squad cars circled empty streets. Some say the name also tied to his work as a courier who moved fast and far. Either way it stuck, and Black Sam, as some also called him, kept climbing. He became a West Side crew chief, then Ayupa's frontman, then underboss to Joseph Ferriola. When Ferriola's heart began to fail, Carlisi took over the day-to-day operations, and when Ferriola died in 1989, Carlisi became the boss outright. The problem was that almost nobody believed he was the right man for it. One Chicago writer who covered the outfit closely described him bluntly as a weak leader who ended up in charge only because there was no better option left standing. After the strawman case and Ferriola's death, the bench was thin, and Carlisi was what remained. His crew ran the western suburbs, Cook and DuPage counties, on the same old menu: bookmaking, juice loans, and the street tax. The protection money the outfit squeezed out of businesses that simply wanted to keep their doors open. But Carlisi's reign would be defined less by what he built than by how badly it came apart, and how quickly. In January of 1992, he was arrested in Florida, caught up in a botched scheme to take over an Indian gambling hall near San Diego. That case ended in a hung jury for him, a genuine stroke of luck. The luck did not last. In December of that same year, federal agents arrested him at O'Hare Airport and charged him with racketeering. The case that followed laid bare just how clumsy the operation under Carlisi had become. In December of 1993, Carlisi and his right-hand man and chauffeur, James Marcello, along with 2 other associates, were convicted of racketeering, loan sharking, and arson. The charges included ordering the thwarted murder of an associate who had fallen out of favor and a botched grenade attack on a movie theater in Oak Park during a union dispute. One of the recordings the government played for the jury captured an associate grabbing a trucking company owner by the throat over an unpaid loan. What the men did not know was that the owner was wearing a federal recording device the whole time. It was a disaster, and it ended Carlisi's run for good. He was sentenced to 13 years. By then his health was failing badly. He suffered from an aortic aneurysm and serious kidney problems, and his court proceedings were repeatedly delayed for surgeries. He never finished his sentence. Sam Carlisi died in custody in January of 1997, his appeal still pending, his name already fading from the headlines. The man whose nickname had once celebrated his talent for slipping away from the police had, in the end, run straight into a federal prison and died there. His conviction did more than remove one weak boss. It exposed how vulnerable the entire Western operation had become, and it sent another, very different kind of man drifting back toward the top. A man who had survived a near-fatal gun battle as a young burglar and carried the proof of it on his own face for the rest of his life. John DeFranzo. During a botched burglary in 1949, a young Chicago thief had part of his own nose sliced clean off in a gun battle with police. The wound healed. Surgeons rebuilt the nose, but the nickname it gave him never faded. For the rest of his life, men in the outfit were so wary of him that they would not even say the name out loud. They would just tap the side of their nose. John DeFranzo was born in Italy in December of 1928 and brought to Chicago as a small child in the mid-1930s. He went to Wells High School and, like so many of these men, found his calling young, in his case as a burglar. He joined a crew known as the 3-Minute Gang, named for their specialty. They could clean out a store and be gone in roughly the 3 minutes it took the police to respond to a tripped alarm. The nose came on a December night in 1949 during a burglary at a dress shop on North Michigan Avenue. A gun battle broke out, and part of DeFranzo's nose was torn away. The accounts differ on exactly how. Some say flying glass, others say a police bullet. Either way, he was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon and served 6 months. And though plastic surgeons later restored the nose, the name No Nose stuck to him permanently. Associates also called him Johnny Bananas, but it was the nose that defined him, and the little tapping gesture men used in place of his name said everything about the fear he commanded. DeFranzo climbed from burglar and enforcer to captain of the Elmwood Park crew, with his hands in juice loans, gambling, extortion, and the waste-hauling business. When Ayupa went to prison, it was DeFranzo he chose to oversee the western suburban operations, and DeFranzo kept rising. In 1993, he was convicted alongside Sam Carlisi in that same failed scheme to seize the California gambling hall. For a moment, it looked as though his run was finished. But then his conviction was reversed on appeal, and DeFranzo walked right back into power. By the mid to late 1990s, he had become the outfit's de facto boss, and he ran it the way the smartest of his predecessors had, quietly, with a decentralized structure that gave prosecutors almost nothing to grab onto. Here is where DeFranzo's story takes its strangest turn. When the great federal case against the outfit finally arrived, a cooperating insider named Nicholas Calabresi testified that DeFranzo had been present at the murders of the Spilotro brothers in 1986, and that he had personally taken a small pistol off one of the dying men. Investigators fully expected him to be charged in a second wave of indictments. That second wave never touched him. To the real surprise of the agents who had built their hopes around him, John DeFranzo was never charged in connection with those killings. He seemed to know it too. When a Chicago investigative reporter sat down to lunch with him in 2009 and asked whether he worried about being prosecuted, DeFranzo said he was not concerned in the slightest. His own attorney, a colorful lawyer known around the courthouse as the Shark, summed up his client's entire career in a single phrase. His greatest achievement, the lawyer said, was beating the government. Still, the organization DeFranzo led was a shadow of what it had once been. One respected mob historian put it plainly, saying that whatever John DeFranzo was, he was certainly no Tony Accardo. He was not running an empire at its peak. He was managing a long, careful decline. DeFranzo died in his River Grove home in May of 2018, at the age of 89, of complications from Alzheimer's disease. He had outlasted the prosecutors, the rivals, and very nearly everyone who had ever tried to put him away. But while DeFranzo was quietly steering the outfit into its twilight, another man, one who had once been Carlisi's driver, was about to be pulled into the most devastating prosecution in the organization's entire history. James Marcello. He reportedly drove two brothers to a basement one summer night in 1986, knowing perfectly well that neither of them would ever walk back out. For 20 years, what happened in that basement stayed buried, both in the ground and in the silence of the men who knew. And then someone who had been there stood up in a federal courtroom and told the entire story. James Marcello was born in Chicago in December of 1943, and his beginnings were almost aggressively ordinary. From 1960 to 1973, he worked for the city's Department of Streets and Sanitation, an honest paycheck. But he was being drawn into something else, and in 1983, he reportedly became a made member of the outfit, a step that, according to one man who later turned on the organization, required pure Italian heritage and participation in at least one killing. He served as a chauffeur and bodyguard, first to Joey Ayupa and then to Sam Carlisi, supervising the Cicero crew's bookmaking, street tax, and juice loans. With his half-brother Michael, He ran a video poker machine business that generated millions of dollars, much of it never reported to the government. His first major fall came alongside Carlisi. In December of 1992, he was indicted with his boss, and in December of 1993, he was convicted. He was sentenced in April of 1995 to 12.5 years. At his sentencing, Marcello looked at the judge and said something that revealed exactly how he saw himself. He told the court that if his last name had been anything other than Marcello, he would not have been standing in front of him at all. He was released in November of 2003, and by the early years of that decade, he had risen to become an acting boss of the outfit. He was a man on his way up, and then the past came back for him. In April of 2005, Marcello and his half-brother were indicted in the case that would become the most damaging prosecution the Chicago outfit had ever faced. He was charged in connection with a string of killings stretching back decades, including the murder of an associate in 1981, an attempted murder in 1982, and, most devastating of all, the June 1986 murders of Anthony and Michael Spilotro. The case was built on a witness the outfit never believed would talk. Nicholas Calabrese, the first made member of the Chicago organization ever to testify for the government, took the stand and described the inner workings of the mob in granular, damning detail. Marcello's own longtime mistress testified that she had received thousands of dollars in cash every month. Marcello, who had been denied bond even after offering more than $12.5 million in property, declined to testify in his own defense. It did not matter. In September of 2007, he was convicted of racketeering conspiracy. Weeks later, the jury held him responsible for the Spilotro murders, accepting the account that he had driven the brothers to their deaths. In February of 2009, James Marcello was sentenced to life in prison. The judge, a man named James Zagel, who would decide the fates of several of these bosses, offered him one dry, devastating observation. He told Marcello that he had, at the very least, maintained the appropriate demeanor in court. Today, James Marcello sits in the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, the most secure facility in the country, where the outfit's reach means absolutely nothing. The man who once climbed from the back of a sanitation truck to the top of Chicago's underworld will spend the rest of his life inside a concrete cell. But Marcello was not the only man undone by that 2007 trial. Sitting at the same defense table was the most flamboyant figure the Chicago outfit ever produced, a man who turned his own criminal trials into a kind of performance art, and who very nearly laughed his way out of justice altogether. Joseph Lombardo. He once strolled into a courthouse holding a newspaper up in front of his face, two eye holes cut neatly into it, peering out at the photographers like a child playing spy. The clown act made him a Chicago legend and earned him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. What it could never do was keep him out of prison. Joseph Lombardo was born Giuseppe Lombardi in Chicago on New Year's Day of 1929, one of 11 children of immigrants from Bari, Italy. He dropped out of high school and joined the outfit in the 1950s as a jewel thief and a collector of juice loans, the brutal high-interest debts the mob extended to desperate men. He had a real talent for staying acquitted. A court victory in 1963 was, remarkably, his 11th acquittal in 11 arrests. He earned two nicknames. Inside the outfit, they called him Lumpy, for the lumps his beatings raised on the men who owed money. To the public, and to the press he so clearly enjoyed, he was Joey the Clown, for the grinning mugshots and the courtroom stunts like that newspaper with the eye holes. A famous photograph from 1978, sometimes called The Last Supper, placed him at a dinner table alongside Accardo and the entire top tier of the organization. The clown, it turned out, had a seat at the highest table in Chicago. Behind the jokes was a serious operator. Lombardo ran the Grand Avenue crew and rose to become the outfit's consigliere, overseeing casino skimming, labor rackets, and the juice loan business. He was a crucial link between the mob and a Teamster pension fund manager named Alan Dorfman, the connection that funneled union money into the outfit's Las Vegas operations. In the early 1980s, he was convicted both of conspiring to bribe a United States senator and in the Las Vegas skimming case, and he went away for years. When he got out, he did something perfectly in character. He took out a classified ad in the Chicago Tribune publicly disavowing any membership in a secret society, insisting he had never taken any oath with guns and daggers, never pricked his finger or drawn blood or burned paper to join a criminal organization. It was equal parts mockery and legal theater. But his defining case was still ahead of him, and it was no joke at all. In April of 2005, Lombardo was indicted in the murder of a former friend named Daniel Seifert. Seifert was a Bensonville businessman who had been set to testify against the outfit in a pension fraud case. On a September morning in 1974, 2 days before he was due to take the stand, he was gunned down in front of his wife and his 4-year-old son, a boy who had actually been named after Lombardo himself. When the indictment came down, Lombardo vanished. He went on the run for nearly 9 months, while the government offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to his capture. He was finally caught in January of 2006 outside a home in Elmwood Park, carrying $3,000 in cash. He had been tracked down, of all things, while going to see Tony Spilotro's dentist brother about an abscessed tooth. At his arraignment, asked why he had not seen a doctor while in hiding, he quipped that he had been, in his own words, unavailable. The trial was the same family secrets prosecution that brought down Marcello. Lombardo testified in his own defense, but the government tied him to the Seifert killing through a fingerprint on the title application for the getaway car and a police scanner he had purchased. In September of 2007, he was convicted and weeks later found responsible for Seifert's murder. In February of 2009, he was sentenced to life, still insisting, to the very end, that he had not killed Danny Seifert. The judge told him plainly that in the end, people are judged by their actions, not by their wit or their smiles. And Seifert's son, the little boy who had once carried Lombardo's name, told him from the courtroom that he did not hate him. He only felt sorry for the life that Lombardo had chosen. Joseph Lombardo died in custody in October of 2019 at the age of 90, serving out his life sentence in the same Colorado Supermax that held the others. The performer who had spent a lifetime laughing at the law had finally run out of jokes. By the time Lombardo's cell door closed for the last time, nearly every man who had ever run the Chicago outfit was either dead or buried inside a federal supermax. The empire Al Capone started finally dismantled, not by rival gangsters, but by wiretaps, accountants, and a single insider willing to talk. What survives in Chicago today is quieter, smaller, and far more careful than anything these 10 men once commanded. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.